we're here to do a bit of a Grizzly Trail. There's amazing history here, fairly bloody, and lots of ghosts and grizzles with it. And one of the grizzles, maybe, is Edward here. Now, you're the resident ghost trail leader. So tell me a little bit about this, because on first glance, and even if you just get onto a computer and type in Berwick ghosts, very little comes up. When I started digging, everything came up.
I think we are the most haunted place in the country. We have the first ever vampire sighting in Berwick, so not many places can beat that.
Absolutely. Know the story, and we'll be telling you that on the trail as we go, but that was before the word vampire was even used.
Yeah.
They weren't calling it that. They called it
undead.
Revelant.
Oh, there's lots of
different
stories.
Interesting stuff, but that's all coming your way. What got you involved in all this?
I was into the history. Someone approached me and he said, do you want to help out? So I said, why not?
I can imagine. So if people want to go on the ghost hunt, what do they do? How do they contact you?
Well, just if they looked up Frank and Night Tours on Facebook, they can find us through there.
Frank and Night Tours.
I'm Edward Frank, and the guy who I do it with is Andrew Knight. So I play on word.
Out of all of the ghost stories that you've got, which is the one that you've had personal access to, either you've had a vivid experience or you've seen something? What's the one that's hit you hardest?
Just near where we are, there's a place called Sandgate, and this is probably the most sighted. And apparently, in the top windows, you can see a servant lady, and we've met the current owners because it was abandoned for years and years.
Yeah.
And we were doing a tour with them, and someone took a photo, and they said, look at this photo, and there was a face in it.
Wow.
But the current owners, when they were saying, oh, I don't believe in it, it's a load of rubbish, but the gentleman was doing work on the top floor, and he said, one day I just froze. I couldn't move for minutes. So I think they've sort of changed their mind that it's haunted or not.
I think you don't believe until you actually have to have an experience yourself, and once you get that, then you've got to revise everything you've ever thought.
Yeah, totally. Lots of the people who come on the tours will say at the beginning, oh, do you believe in ghosts? And a lot of them will say, oh no, it's a load of rubbish and all that. But when you go around, you start telling their own stories. So I think that the majority of people are actually believers and they have their own stories.
No, I believe that. And I remember one guy saying to me, oh, I don't believe in all this, I don't believe in all this. And then at the end of the afternoon or whatever, he's coming up and he's saying, I did see something once when... So everybody's got their own little personal switch on it. Well, I hope you get a lot of business from it. Yeah, Thank you very much. Sandgate, what do we know? How will we know this when we're walking along Sandgate so we can watch out for the girl?
So Sandgate is the house which goes onto the quayside in Berwick, and there's a gate there, but it's a house to the right of it which is called the Gatehouse.
We'll be watching.
Got windows. Henry VIII, he helped design the gun battlement, and his son built a castle, the Edward VI Citadel.
Wow.
And Elizabeth decided to knock them down and build a wall, so they were only there for like 10, 20 years, and they knocked it down to build something else.
She was a feisty woman, ginger, you see. Ginger people, that's what happens.
Well, the Berwick walls, the Elizabethan walls, they are equivalent to the cost of Trident now.
Blimey.
So it was billions.
Billions, that's amazing. I mean, when you see, at first look, the city from across the river looks magnificent, but to think about how you would go about building it, even if you had to do it new, you couldn't put a price on that and that kind of stuff. Well, Edward, thank you very much for that. We've got to get off and get set on this Grizzly Trail. Passing through like a kitchen area now, just so that you can picture what we're doing. Out of every window in Berwick, because it's so beautiful, you're seeing things. The big chicken hotel over yonder, and we are now at the lift, so we're going to be heading straight down. I tell you, and it's waiting for us as well. Heading down. There's so much in here, and volunteering, a whole host of events that's happening here at the Youth Hostel Association. This is beautiful, I have to say. Isn't it better than...
It's really nice, yeah. It looks modern as well.
When I just saw the cafe at the beginning, I would quite happily... Anybody could go in there and just have a cup of tea or something. Beautiful. Oh, how ghost huntery is the piano in the reception. And now we're back in main reception, and we are just about to head out. So, an automatic door... that I'm helping, and we're out. And you know, on the stairs there we were talking about the vampire. Now, a lot of people think that vampires are merely like a work of fiction. Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee saying, I don't drink wine, and then plunging his clay fangs into a poor unfortunate actress's neck. It's surprising that just about every culture, race and religion has its own vampire story, though. To some, a vampire is known as a voodoo de l'arc. To others, wampire, vampire, penaglin, nosferatu, moronis. The list goes on and on depending on which continent you're on. So it should be no surprise that these creatures have seemingly invaded Britain too. The story's set around a small village that is now part of this town, Berwick, being swallowed up in the early 1900s. In this area, a man by the name of Colin McFadden used to survive on growing his vegetables and breeding sheep, scraping a modest living off the land. His fiancée was Betty Hoff. Some legends say she was a prostitute, others she was unemployed. We'll give her the benefit of the doubt. Now, Colin had sworn that as soon as he could earn enough to look after her, they would be married. And this was their great aim in life. He devoted every spare moment into trying to transform a cottage, more a hovel, into a building suitable for a new bride. And on a Friday night, they would meet in a local tavern overlooking the river here, literally within 100 yards of where I am now. They'd have a few drinks, a sing-song, they'd head off into the countryside to find a quiet little nook or cranny to make love. Now, halfway through the evening, both having downed a few jars of the loopy juice, Betty excused herself and headed over to visit the old farmyard toilet. There was a hole in the ground with a plank over it, and she never returned. Several other women tried to make use of the plank, but the door was bolted. After half an hour, Colin asked the landlady, a portly, fun-filled woman known to all Berwick residents as Bella, to investigate. So off she went, found the door locked, so asked her husband to force it open. And there, still seated on the plank, was Betty, whose throat had been ripped out, and the blood was still trickling down her purple dress, her face ashen pale, as if the life had been sucked out of her. Local gossips make the most of the only bit of excitement Beric had experienced for years, and throughout the countryside lambs were found drained of blood, their throats torn open. At first, farmers had blamed foxes and domestic dogs that used to roam in packs down country lanes. But now they had another possibility. A vampire was at loose. The murder of Betty Hoff was put down to a crime of passion, claiming that she was a prostitute and had been selling her body in the toilet, and an argument erupted, and her punter had slit her throat. This failed to take into account that her boyfriend was waiting for her and that her body was totally there was no blood in it. The wound to her throat was made by teeth and not a blade. 3 months later, a young girl was picking blackberries by a farm cart track, roughly where the industrial estate is near Morrison Supermarket. The 18-year-old had been told not to be out later than 6 in the evening, but it had been a glorious summer's day and she'd swum in the Tweed, she'd slept in the field, picked flowers. She hadn't collected that amount of blackberries demanded by her mother, so she was kind of playing catch-up. The sky was beginning to blacken when a figure approached, shoulders hunched, a dirty tramp-like man with eyes of fiery red, and she turned to quickly walk down the lane, only to be jumped on and pushed into the hedgerow. And as he lay on top of her, she screamed as he opened his mouth, showing 2 large fangs. She tried to push him away, keeping his snapping mouth away from her skin, and at that moment, a group of labourers returning from the fields saw what was happening and captured him. They took him to see the local magistrate, who declared he was a madman and not a vampire, despite the fact he did have enlarged teeth, bigger than normal, resembling fangs. They gave orders to lock up the tramp. They put him in a barn until he could be moved to a proper prison. On his way to that barn, he leapt at one of his guards, literally tearing out his Adam's apple, leaving the man writhing on the ground as other guards glared in horror. He was off over the fields, and before the others could reach him, he disappeared into the darkness. The following morning, dogs were brought in to complete the search. They followed his scent to a small copse of trees deep in the woodland interior. There was a make-do shelter, 12 planks of wood leaning against a tree, no cooking utensils, merely a bowl of blood. No sign of anyone, but there was a hole dug into the bankside. It seemed too big for rabbits, foxes or badgers, so they reached inside. and they felt a man's foot. Recoiling in horror, they were a bit unsure what to do, until Colin McFadden stepped out of the throng to say, "Dig the bastard up." He grabbed a spade and began hacking away at the earth until you could see the outline of a body, and as the soil fell away, the man's eyes opened and he screamed as the light of the sun hit his face. He struggled free on the ground and dived into the shadows, trying desperately to avoid the rays of the sun. Colin shouted, "See, he is a vampire. Kill him, or it'll be your women who die next." McFadden struck the first blow, and using the edge of his spade, he swung at the tramp's neck, almost severing the head. The others began belting away at the helpless torso with scythes, clubs, old swords and shovels, battering the body until there was nothing left but pulp. They scraped up the remains, hurled them onto a bonfire, and Berwick's more recent vampire was consumed by the flames. There's another vampire story, but that's a little bit further down the lane. Let's walk on to our next place. We're walking up the alley along the side of the hostel and looking at the old bowed walls kind of stretching out ahead of you. Cobbles, as there always was in this part of the world. It's lit now at night time as you come up to the top of the street. If you come out of the same alley, you'll see the Lowry picture. There's actually a tale about this alley leading down. If you look at the picture, the hostel is in fact the building that Lowry painted all those years ago. Now, how many of you have heard of Lowry? Of course, there was a record out called "We're Painting Matchstalk Men and Matchstalk Cats and Dogs," and this is the guy that did those kind of paintings. Lawrence Stephen Lowry would visit this part of Berwick regularly from 1935, choosing various sites to paint in his unique and definitive style. Today, here at Berwick, there's a Lowry Trail going around the 18 places that he painted whilst he was here. And the incredible thing is that none of these places have changed. It's the painting on the wall here is exactly what you can see when you look down the alley. When you see his Matchstalk Men and Matchstalk Cats and Dogs, you see people have buttoned up coats because they're Berwick folk, fighting the winds up the North Sea. No other city in Britain has a more grand arrival than crossing that 28-span viaduct of the Royal Border Bridge. And from that glorious bridge, lit in rainbow lights at night, you can see the tiny military bridges, the long cobbled streets, and in the distance, the beautiful beach at Spittal. But this is the tiny alley that Lowry painted, where the wall bulges out, and the further you travel down, the narrower it gets. Some thought he'd painted it incorrectly using his artistic licence, yet even today it is identical, exactly the same. And this is a lane called Joas Lane, but it's off Sallyport. When Lowry was hospitalised at the Woods Hospital in Glossop, Derbyshire, he told his friends that he wanted one final trip to Berwick. He said that bracing Berwick air would put me right. Book a train, get me out of here. He never got his wish. Yet tickets were bought and paid for, left by his hospital bed as Lowry died of pneumonia. He even spoke about being buried here in Berwick. However, they placed him in the same cemetery as his parents in Manchester. Perhaps this is why so many people have seen this small man with tiny glasses and grey hair walking around the alley near Sallyport. Some have even walked through him, wearing an ill-fitting brown suit covered with specks of paint. J.S. Lowry has returned here to Berwick in spirit. MOD, Ministry of Unisex hair salon is directly opposite the edge of the alley. I wonder what they've spotted in their mirrors over the years. The most common image is just a figure walking along this street and disappearing. And on one occasion, a 2014 group of 8 people were coming out of an Indian restaurant, which is directly ahead of me by about the Magna Tandoori restaurant, celebrating its 30th year. It's actually a really good Indian restaurant. A group of 8 people came out of that Indian restaurant onto Bridge Street, and they saw an old man in a tatty brown suit rushing along the road. He dropped a lot of paper onto the pavement and half a dozen brushes onto the tarmac. 3 of the crowd ran to help him pick it all up, and the figure disappeared in front of them. None of them were drunk. They all saw it absolutely clearly. It's appropriately on the edge of that little lane where one of the world's greatest ever painters has his spirit that there should be an art shop next door. I'm following Hollywood McShane, who's got our little Grizzly map that he's made. We're pressing the moule on rouge, which is every shop has a very individual title down here. But we mentioned that Beric, the name from way back, 3,000 years before the Romans, barley was farmed here. So from a combination of ber, meaning barley, and wick, meaning farmer settlement, Berwick, history explodes out of this incredible and beautiful fishing port. During the first plague in 1348, Berwick was almost exterminated. Less than 15% of the population would survive the Black Death. And due to the ships from the south of England docking in Berwick, and that's just at the bottom of the street to the right-hand side, the gate down to the docks is, to this side of the docks is just down there. Ships would dock down there, and they would bring the plague back in 1361, and it took another half of the population. But now, at the base of that street, beside the Bank of Scotland, this is going to be a slog walking and reading, so just bear with me. Deep breath. The families that remained in Berwick and survived were obviously a real hardy bunch. The good thing is, when you pass people here, they always say hello. Nice respectful nod. And in the Domesday Book, it writes how the English King Charles I agreed to the building of Berwick's Church of the Holy Trinity. Money forcibly collected from the people here in Berwick and across the country to have it constructed. Some of the walls of Berwick Castle were pulled down to get the stone for the church. We're right outside, if you're following our footsteps, the King's Arms Hotel at the moment. So the locals were appalled. The rich church deciding to flog some more money out of the poor to have an incredible and huge bell tower built. However, by the time King Charles had been decapitated by Oliver Cromwell, he made one of his bases next to the main car park next to B&M, which is about half a mile up this road. On his way to fight in the Battle of Dunbar, Cromwell refused to allow the building to have a tower. He said he loathed church bells. So that's why this church is one of only two in the UK with a flat roof. The main car park has another story attached to it that involves Cromwell. One day the leader of the country and creator of the new model army, the Roundheads, came out to watch his men parading on the grassy area of the car park near the sea wall. Now today, you can park your car right up against the sea wall. He walked along this huge parapet overlooking the car park, now a grassy knoll, and he commented how proud he was, having full control of that part of the borders that was known for its extreme violence. At that, one of his lieutenants, a fop called Haynes, shouted, "Sir, you must sign these documents before you go out. I implore you." His high-pitched voice was like chalk down a blackboard to Cromwell. "Well, give them here," he screeched as the officer tried to hang them up. Now this required Cromwell's aid to kneel down and reach as far as he could. Cromwell, standing next to the rows of cannonballs, he brushed against one with his boot and sent it rolling. It missed his aid, but it smashed right into the lieutenant's face, knocking him to the ground and killing him. The documents that were so important that had to be signed blew in all directions in the wind off the North Sea, and Cromwell said, "It seems the good Lord does not want them signed, nor him to live." He then got on his horse and rode off, leaving another ghost often seen drifting along the rocky grass outcrop over the car park. Lieutenant Haynes, often seen in full uniform and metal helmet, walks to this day very early in the morning, especially on misty days when the sea frets in. The most popular story, though, from Berwick involves the war between Beric and Russia. Yet it was all merely a clerical error. When Queen Victoria declared war against Russia in 1854, she declared that Wales, Berwick-upon-Tweed and the Kingdom of England, Ireland and all parts of Great Britain was at war with Russia. Yet after the war, the British government wrote, Wales, Scotland and all parts of the kingdom and England, Ireland is now at peace. But that left everybody at peace except Berwick. And they were still at war after the so-called peace deal in 1914. Now, from 1914 all the way through to 1966, technically, little Berwick was at war with Russia. In 1966, a Soviet official visited the town to shake hands on a peace deal, just in case Berwick got a bit bolshy. Berwick Mayor Robert Knox said, please tell the Russian people that now they can sleep peaceably in their beds. And I thought, one of the greatest lines by one of the greatest northern politicians in the last 100 years. We're at the bottom now of Marygate, which is like the main street of Berwick, just passing Ramsden's on the left hand side if you're keeping pace with us, and past Bark and Sports Direct here as well. We're heading to the British Red Cross shop. This particular charity shop appeared in all the national newspapers not so long ago, when the staff were physically chased out the shop by a ghost. So we're heading there now, passing Greg's and Costa on the right hand side, Thomas Cook and Claire's. So wherever you happen to be living at the time, this has got to be a place that you can come and visit, because if you follow this particular trail, and I know thousands of you will, then you will learn an enormous amount of ancient and amazing history about one of the most fascinating and most fought over towns anywhere, passing Bon Marché. Further reductions, we also have Vision Express, the Calendar Club, Card Factory, Clark's, Burton's, Dorothy Perkins, Savers, and you don't have to sprint. It's not a race. And directly in front of me, the British Heart Foundation. And what's your name, darling?
Hi, my name's Debbie.
Apparently, this shop, there's stuff going on every day in here.
Yeah, there has been for a while, nearly, not quite every day, but every week, every month, there's something.
Talk us through because there was one day you ended up in the national newspapers because something chased you out. So what exactly happened that day?
I mean, we've had various things happen, but I think the worst where it got quite physical was when we had a family who came to visit. I was showing them round, and a bag came round the corner and down the stairs and just missed them. So on its own, yeah. And there was no bags at the top of the stairs, so it's actually had to come out of a room and round the corner and down the stairs.
Unbelievable. I gather you've been unkindly treated yourself.
I have. Quite a few times I've had just like somebody behind me pulling my collar until it's tight. So yeah, that's quite scary. But I mean, every day we hear footsteps going up the stairs. We can hear them walking from room to room upstairs. You know.
The thing is, you know who it is.
We do know who it is, or we think we know. It's William Crowe, who was a chemist here in the 1700s, and we think possibly his wife from now and again.
The whole wife thing, I gather there's an amazing, I mean, this is literally 1,000,000 to 1 kind of coincidence that they came here after you'd found this mysterious ring. Tell us the story.
Yeah, I was in the office one day doing paperwork, and I had my piles of paper and I was turning back and forward, and then I turned and there was a ring, very old ring with stones missing, just on a pile of papers. And I thought, oh, where's that come from? Strange. So I just sat to the side. And later on that day, Dorothy came in, one of our volunteers who's like a spiritualist. Right. And she took the ring home with her to see if she could get anything from it, and I went back to my home, and I was sitting that night and I just got this name Annie pop into my head for no reason. And then Dorothy came in the next day and said, oh, I'm getting Annie off this ring. Ooh. So thought, right,
amazing coincidence up to that point.
Yeah, but I thought, just sat it aside. And then 2 weeks later I was outside and there was a family looking up at the windows, and I said, oh, can I help you? And they said, oh, we're here to research our ancestors, William Crowe and his wife Annie. Oh,
so boom.
I nearly dropped to the floor then, because that was just amazing how we found that ring, or that ring appeared 2 weeks earlier.
And I know we've been hearing that other members of staff have heard stuff, and when you're here on your own, you won't go and visit where where Mr. Crow lives on the 3rd floor.
No, I won't go up. Everybody here knows that Debbie does not do the 3rd floor. It's just, you don't even ask. Even my boss.
Debbie did Dallas, but she'll not do the 3rd floor.
So, everybody else needs to go up. But I get halfway up the stairs and I just feel really cold.
Yeah.
I don't like it. It's really, really unpleasant, scary feeling.
And yet, Mr. Crow did you a favour, apparently, when you got some new contact lenses in.
He did. This is one of the first things that happened. I got contact lenses and I was driving to work actually thinking I need to get a little mirror today just for putting my contacts in.
Right.
So I came in, nobody else was in the building, I was first in, and there at the end of the stairs banister, which is a point, it comes to a point, was a little mirror balancing. So I thought, thanks William, that'll do.
Unbelievable. I mean, the kind of stuff that goes on. And the other thing is, when we were contacting you, you seem to know, because obviously you talk to everybody else who works up and down this street, and Berwick's a very small, tight little town centre. You'll know everybody. Most of the shops are haunted.
There's quite a few haunted, and it's the kind of thing when things happen you think a lot of people don't believe, so you don't really talk about it, you don't tell people. Right. But because we had this story come out a few years ago, everybody
they've all come to you.
They're all coming to me and saying, "Oh, we've got somebody, and this happens," and it's amazing because I just thought nobody will really believe it, but and hairdressers and bookshops, the train station, all over. Yeah.
My goodness. Well, we've still got a fair bit of trail to go. I've already got my knees knocking. Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Have fun.
Now, I must admit, I'm making a point of walking quickly away, but I've got to have a look at it, just to glance up and maybe take a photograph of the 3rd floor where Edward's supposed to be. Because these houses are age old, There's one particular window. You can imagine Edward having a peek out of there, couldn't you? Wow. Take a couple of shots, you might get him. Not 100 yards away is the town hall. We've walked past it a few moments ago to get up here to the charity shops, and it's probably one of the most prominent buildings, if not the most prominent building in all of Berwick. It houses a market, a bookshop, a cafe, but it's the centrepiece of this wonderful town, and it stood here since the 16th century. Now, this is where criminals were sentenced, marriages were held, the Guild of Freemen governed all of the town's affairs from here. And if you do actually choose to come down and you park on the side of the road, because you can park at the side of the road, there's a really lovely Chinese restaurant just down here on your right hand side, worth giving a go to, trust me. Now, in this building, apparently, you can enter the old jail cells where those not paying their bills or taxes would be housed. You can read some of the graffiti scratched on the walls by prisoners, some just common drunks, but others condemned prisoners waiting for the gallows to be built in front of the building. Now, if you look at the front of the building, you will see like Romanesque columns and a huge staircase leading up. But if you can imagine, back in the day, there was a major road on both sides. One is now like a little shopping alley, the other is the main road. But back in the day, imagine a gallows right at the front of that building and crowds of up to 1,000 gathering to see somebody who's done something nasty get topped. Many were hanged here in Berwick during the rough times, yet one man kept failing to pay his dues. It was an ex-fisherman called Thomas Longbone. Now, here's the thing. If you go a little bit further up, we pass a shop called Longbones, so I'm presuming his relatives. But Thomas Longbone had lodgings on nearby Hyde Hill, which is just behind the town hall. He'd stopped fishing, and he had no money to his name, so they wanted to kick him out. However, Longbone was an aggressive man, hated by his own family, prone to acts of extreme violence, and his ex-wife and child ran a grocer's shop on Church Street, again, just around the corner from here. But what they would do is they would make a point of keeping as far away from this guy as possible. He was said to have killed a fellow fisherman on a fight during a sea trip by biting his throat until he bled to death. This was said to be in self-defence. And as two fellow crewmen spoke up for him, he got away with it. He had broken many a nose, destroyed a number of taverns here, and the local authorities wanted rid of him. So one freeman of Berwick suggested that he was arrested for non-payment of rent. This helped out the landlord. Then once he was in custody, they would decide how they were going to get rid of him. He was put in the cells and forgotten about. Or maybe they just left him. It was said that by the time they discovered his rotting corpse, it had liquefied and half of it was missing because the rats had fed on him. The Longbourn family stayed in Berwick, free of his constant harassment, and the streets were safer too. And it seems his ancestors remain here. If you go up the Mary Gate, the main street, eventually you'll come to that little roundabout that can lead you into the car park. Just before that, there's a little side street with a glorious Chinese restaurant there, and that's where you'll find Longbourn's shop. So the Longbourns are a great name to have, isn't it? They say that at night, from this town hall, and this is something, if you're doing any kind of ghost hunting in Berwick, they say that if you come here at night time, you can sometimes hear a scratching from underneath the town hall, from the base of the walls, the scraping of a tin cup along a stone, howls of old Longbourn slowly starving to death. He was never fed nor watered, and thanks to eating insects and licking rainwater from the walls and condensation, it took him almost 11 months to die. So that's why you can still hear him at the town hall. So, where do we move on from here? See, as soon as we've finished the town hall, starts to celebrate us. Because if you go back, 50,000 years BC, right? So that's technically 52,000 years ago. You can discover ancient burial sites on the outskirts of Berwick, like old circular barrows, like the Routening Linn. The men of Berwick had a reputation throughout the ages for being hard-working, yet particularly excelling in fighting. After Longshanks had defeated the Scots, a Berwick man called Liam Dunn was given the job to protect and defend young Prince Edward, right here. And during one conflict, Liam saw how the young prince had attacked the enemy. And it was here, if you're standing outside of New Look, Holland and Barrett's here, Home Bargains, you'll see there's a little bit that's got modern cobbles on it. But it used to have, obviously, old-fashioned cobbles. And it was right here that the young prince fought a man who'd been insulting to his father, the king. And Liam wrote, "The young prince enjoyed it rather too much. When this unarmed man raced towards us, the prince said, 'Nay, Liam, leave him to me.' He took out of his sword and took 25 minutes to kill him. Finally, the young prince was sitting on the cobbles, the top of Mary Gate, in a pile of body parts just hacking and hacking away. I thought, if this is how he dispatches a single unarmed man, whatever will he be like when he becomes king?" 3 months later, Prince Edward headed off to the Crusades in the Holy Land, 1270. He wanted to make a name for himself, as his father had against the Scots. So he and an English army of almost 4,000 men reached a rise in the desert, and there below him was the home of Jesus, Nazareth. There were no enemy soldiers there, just a gentle and innocent town filled with people enjoying a busy fish market. They saw the troops on the hill. They thought nothing of it. They had no riches, nor did they have anybody trying to defend the place. No soldiers, no rebels. Their English guests would be welcome. They would feed them, they would water them, and then they would leave. He told Liam, "This town opposes us, we must destroy them." Liam said, "This is the town of Nazareth." He said there were just women, children and old men. There's no fighting men there. Prince Edward ignored that and ordered his men to massacre every living soul. Almost 2,700 innocents were raped and murdered for sport. The prince ordered his men to take everyone's head off, including newly born babies, pile them at the gate of the town as a warning. When he returned to England in 2074, he discovered that he was king. His father had died, Edward the Longshanks. The North was in peace, so Liam, who was under orders to the late king, made his excuses and returned to Beric. It is said that he was so ashamed of the murders that he and his fellow crusaders had committed there, he became mad and obsessed about it, eventually hanging himself in his full crusader's armour from a tree here in Berwick. And this is the exact site where that happened, because this is the place where Berwick places its Christmas tree every year, pretty much outside of Home Bargains on the cobbles. And you think, well, they put the Christmas tree here for a reason. Well, maybe it's because it's exactly the place where that guy hanged himself in his crusader suit all those years ago to exorcise the evil that he'd done. The precise place, if you're looking for where he hanged himself, is technically just outside of Shoe Zone, at the top of roughly where the Berwick News and Berwick Advertiser building is. Lots of little neat alleys. If you look to the left hand side, you can see the little bridge that brings you in and takes you out. But we're heading now to a couple of places. We'll get a picture of Longbones first, but we have an alley that we have to go down, and it's an alley that a lot of people tourists probably don't know about, and it's all uphill, so please bear with us at the present moment. Just round this corner, this is where the Chinese is. Great Chinese. Check out the chicken satay. It comes in gravy, doesn't come in peanut sauce. You would think, well, that's not going to work, but it does. There's Longbones, H. Longbone and Son. Amazing. You pass the Diamond Tattooists on your left hand side, and there is the Golden Star, way back. You know, we mentioned a vampire story earlier on, but long before the word vampire was ever even known to anybody, way back, a man called William Parvus, also known as William of Newburgh, who was at that time an Augustine canon, he wrote a fascinating story of Berwick. 1160, he wrote, "At the mouth of the River Tweed, in the jurisdiction of the King of Scotland, there stands a noble city that is Berwick upon Tweed. Here lived a certain man, very rich and a great rogue. Having died and having been buried, he rose again from the grave and sallied forth. The locals saw that he had left his resting place and set the dogs on him. Following a trail of his rotting, decaying flesh, he struck great fear into all of Berwick before returning to his tomb in the morning. No one chose to be out of doors once this unruly corpse had risen, and it rose every evening. It's said that one night it came to Chapel Street, which if you keep walking, you should actually be passing Chapel Street. Yeah, here we go. Chapel Street, right here on the right-hand side. And there's a pub on the corner called the Cobbled Yard Hotel. It used to be a tavern back in the day. And somebody was weird enough to come out in the early hours, stagger out after having a few jars, and she was killed by the zombie, by the walking dead. The wise locals sought a cure for the creature that infested the city, using what they described as pest of various deeds. 3 men with their throats torn out, children seized never to be found, cattle ripped and torn. Finally, the councilmen declared enough, and they procured 10 bold men the following morning to dig up this horrible carcass. Their job was to hack it limb from limb, reducing the creature merely to fuel the flames of a bonfire. Now there's a small graveyard just up the road where Berwick Infirmary now stands. Whilst this was being done, they burnt them in front of what is now the infirmary, just up the road, next to the car park. Again, we keep talking about this famous car park. We'll be in it in a minute. However, whilst this was all going on, some of the local women fainted, others ran away, hearing this creature roar. His arms were cut off, his legs were cut off. The church elders declared that it was the voice of Satan, and that cry would visit every one of them if they didn't attend the church. Now, the problem came when they tried to extinguish the flames. Cinders had blown onto the roofs of the row of houses nearby, and over 200 homes here in Berwick were destroyed. Even once this monster had been destroyed, the pestilence continued. It didn't stop, as the devil sought to make the good people of Berwick suffer. The word zombie didn't exist back then, nor vampire. Instead, these creatures returning from the dead were called revenants. You would be surprised how many stories of these creatures exist, and proof, sworn testimony. In the 12th century, a revenant, a member of the undead, walked across a bridge, hurling Berwick citizens into the river. Some church folk tried to explain that these folk were not really dead, merely suffering from the plague. I'm standing now at Wallace Green in front of the church. There's a famous 15th century poem that talks about 3 kings and the 3 dead, where 3 border kings met 3 hideous long dead corpses. The creatures warned them not to overindulge on life's pleasures, because if they did, they would neglect their prayers and God would give them the ultimate downfall. These stories all try to scare people into buildings like this, the church, the richest organisation on earth, and locals saw these wealthy priests surrounded by slaves and concubines, bending their faith as it suited them. They wanted to keep their money not wasted on these fakers, but the king forced everybody to attend church. Those who didn't were often arrested, murdered, or called a heathen and executed, and then all of their land and money would go to the church. Now, in this church, you often find a symbol on gravestones of a skull and crossbones. Now, some say this was put here by the family after one of their number died of the plague here. However, not just here at St Andrews. If you go and have a look at the east wall of another church that's a little bit further south of here, called Trinity Church, you'll find a grave that we believe has international significance. If you check around St Andrews, you'll see a couple with the skull and crossbones on them. Now, some say the Scottish people just put that symbol to denote the fact that there was death there. Some said, obviously it's a pirate. Well, there was piracy off the coast here, so yes, it could be. However, the most interesting theory, especially of the one that's at the Trinity Church, is that it was connected to a Knights Templar. Now, using this insignia to deter enemies from disturbing them. These appertaining to the protectors of Jesus' family. Escaping the Middle East. Now, if they were the long-sworded Templars, there's a way to find out. If it's just a plain skull and crossbones, probably not. But if they happen to have a grave for the Knights Templars, then they would have a Celtic rose directly above the skull and a scroll directly on the right-hand side of the skull face. Now, if you visit the one on Trinity Church, there's a Celtic rose directly above the skull and a scroll directly on the right-hand side. Now, we're walking back on the opposite side of the road past Greaves Western Air Wealth Management. Blimey, wealth management. Must be some people got some in this part of the world. Sadly, not myself. Lots of taxis around here as well. This is one of the places where they drive into the centre, and because the system's so tight, they use it as a place to just spin around. There's the edge of the great car park, and you can see on the right-hand side when you're walking down here, the escarpment, the city wall, and that's the place that Oliver Cromwell rolled that cannonball down on somebody's head that we told you about before. It's just up here. You'll get a proper look if you continue to walk our way. But I'm taking you back now to the mid-1600s, all the way through to the late 1800s. Little Berwick upon Tweed had a constant battle with press gangs. Many a tall ship would sail into port, discovered hundreds of hardy fishermen all perfect to work on ships. So they would have a night out in the town's bustling taverns, especially the one facing you, called the Brewers Arms. Now the Brewers Arms is lit up, looking beautiful. It's directly in front, next door to Ladbrokes and Iceland Frozen Food just before that. The Brewers Arms was the pub of choice of the press gangers, and it still exists to this day. Old, quaint, hasn't changed in 200, 300 years. It was a tavern then, the Brewers Tavern. It's now the Brewers Arms. Beautiful little place. And yet, if you turn around at Skelly's, which is a family butcher, lovely people, they cut meat. They say, what do you want? They'll cut you a piece of meat, specifically old-fashioned, proper butchers. As you walk up the hill, you can see the bridge directly ahead of you. Now, if you're walking the walls of Berwick, and you can just walk along the top of that, and it'll take you right the way around the entire walls of the castle. You stop a bit. To the right-hand side, there's a little alley, and looking along there, it's every day it's a place called Sinners. It's a breakfast place, really. You get to do a full English breakfast. But it's because of little alleys like this that our next story comes about. Because here is the alley to the right-hand side. You go up a number of steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, away from the traffic, to a little quiet siding that's heavily lit. Now, to the left-hand side of it, you've got City Wall, which goes above the car park, like I mentioned before. And it's directly here, outside a place that has a title, the Elizabethan Townhouse, guest accommodation, beautiful, to your right-hand side. And it's around this area. I'm going to sit down on the steps that's halfway to my left-hand side. You should be able to pull them out. Clangs behind you. And you find yourself at the top of a load of stairs. Directly over that mound is the car park. The one that Oliver Cromwell kicked that cannonball on his lieutenant's head. Oh, forgive me a second, but just need to catch my breath. It's been a major walk. It's been mainly uphill. So I'm here to tell you about these tall ships and the idea that they loved the thought that they wouldn't have to train people to be a seaman. They just had to come to Berwick and they'd find fishermen here. They'd have a night out in the tavern, particularly the one we've just mentioned. And then when they got the guys drunk, they'd just say, hey, come with us for another drink. We'll take you to the ship. We'll give you a drink. Take them to the ship. They'd never get off the ship. The ship would sail. And they've captured all of these people. It was an amazing and clever thing. One major tavern stood just off Marygate behind the Elizabethan townhouse. And that is the Brewers Arms we were talking about. There was a few ways they did it. In some cases, they would gamble with the men. And dominoes was very common. There was also dice back then. So what they would do is they would gamble with the fishermen. And if the fisherman lost a lot of money, 9 times out of 10, the fishermen wouldn't have enough money to pay the money back. So they would have to join a king's ship and sail from Berwick on a journey that could last them 9 months to 9 years. The other way was, of course, they would slide a king's shilling into the man's drink. And when the man got to the bottom of his glass, he'd see a shilling in the bottom and think, whoa, there's money in here. They'd put the money out. As soon as that money tipped into his hand, he was a king's man. He'd signed up. He'd joined the navy. That's the reason why tankards later on had glass bottoms, so that if somebody was trying to find sailors this way, the other guy could look at the bottom of his tankard and make sure there wasn't a shilling in it before he started drinking it, so he wouldn't be caught out. So this long alley, it's now a row of fairly modern houses, or certainly houses that have been duded up. Cars parked outside, barely enough room to get 2 cars down this road, but that's what's here. This is where there was a despicable act. A local Berwick fisherman had been out celebrating with his 16-year-old son called Connor. They'd been out on his first fishing trip and he'd done well. As the pair of them sunk into a jolly drunken state, a local ship's captain thought they both would be fine additions to his crew. One experienced seaman and a boy who could be easily shaped. So on leaving the tavern, they headed back towards Marygate to walk up along this little alleyway. They had a small fisherman's cottage where they lived at a place called Ravensdown. Before they got 30 feet along this alley, a dark alley back in the day, there'd be no lights on it, they were surrounded by men. The old fisherman was drunk, but still sober enough to pull out his gully knife and slash one of them across the bridge of the nose. Young Connor could barely stand. He had no idea what was happening. The old man held off the men and told Connor to run. And he tried to run, stumbling, falling down the steps that we've just walked up, into Marygate, across the track, into bushes, onto Meg's Mount. Now, Meg's Mount is still there. Meg's Mound is still there. The mound was an Elizabethan gun emplacement, named, some say, after a doxy, a lady of easy virtue, who entertained the soldiers regularly, charged with manning the position. I think her positions must have been equally interesting, judging by the fact they still call it Meg's Mound after all those years. So Connor was hidden in the tree line there, in the black, and he stared along this alley to watch in silhouette his father being literally cut to pieces by the sailors. They sliced him open. They pulled out his intestines and hung them across the alley from one side to the other like Christmas decorations. One hacked his head off and stuck it onto a spiked railing. The railings are still here, and the spikes are still there too. The alley flooded with blood, and the blood ran backwards downhill towards where Connor was hiding, dripping down the steps, running down Marygate. Young Connor wanted to scream, but he didn't want to be taken either. Now, from that day on, Connor and his friends made it their duty to keep an eye out for all of the crews visiting Berwick. Anyone trying to steal its men would face a gang of rowdies who would fight to take them. It's known that over 70 men were saved from a life at sea by this disorderly gang, and the crew responsible for his father's death never returned. So what an amazing story from this tiny little alley that at one time had the intestines of a man, some say still alive at the time, decorating the lane like bizarre Christmas decorations. So let me tell you of a story of another very secret part of Berwick upon Tweed that not everybody knows. One of the most famous ghost stories that there is here as we just come down from the mound. There's a dog here waiting to hear the stories, I think. That's what it is.
Just stubborn.
Just stubborn.
What a movement. Come on, this way.
Have a good night, man. No, there's an amazing story from Berwick down here, and as you're just walking down at this time of night, the shadows and the darkness as you approach the front steps, look at the lane directly in front of you. It ultimately will take you to the castle, straight ahead, and that's where we're going. We're going down by the riverside. That's where we're heading now. Got to be careful on this road because this is the main roundabout, the main crossover. And there's the car park we keep telling you about to the right-hand side. If you come to Berwick, that's probably where you'll park along here. And if you walk far enough down, you come to the seawall. If you don't come to the seawall, you go the opposite direction, you will see the hospital, what is the equivalent of Berwick's A&E. That's the bonfire spot where that creature, the early vampire, was found. Now, you've got to be real careful here because during the day, the one thing you will find here is everybody will stop for you and let you across. Everybody. They're lovely, kindly, warm people. But at night time, it's every man for himself. So we're doing the riverside walk to the old castle. But it's along this lane that there's a story. Now, the savage North Sea has kept the northerners fed since the dawn of time. And long before the Romans, back at least 6,000 years ago, old tribal fisher folk came to this area near the sea to thrive from the abundance of fish, seafood, and also, of course, feeding on the wild birds. Now, on Spittal Beach, they discovered old remains where the old tribesmen and women deposited their rubbish. Old scallop shells where the contents had been eaten. Lots of seabird bones. Shells of every type. Rubbish of very different types found in ancient middens. Now, in this area, there's an ice cream shop here. And the area directly in front of the ice cream shop is the place where late at night you may just be able to come across the bleating bairn, the crying boy. He's probably Berwick's most famous ghost. And this ghost has been heard sobbing here for almost 700 years. The ancient pagans, essentially the people without any gods, just a firm belief in nature, used to give a token to the sea every time they took from it. They would give a fish back. They would throw in a shiny pebble or a model that they'd carved from wood or stone, just to say thank you. The Roman sailors copied this practice, dropping a coin, dropping some jewellery, a sword to placate the swirling waters. Once the Vikings came over to Berwick, they continued the practice, but they took it to a very different place, because down by the riverside where we're going now, they would give a very different offering to the gods, often a human sacrifice, usually one of the rich portly friars who badly used their slaves that would give them a fine life. They would pretend to serve their god. The Vikings had even skinned a priest alive, folded the skin into a book-sized parcel, and then hurled it into the deep. To this day, some Berwick fishermen still flick a coin into the sea if the weather looks rough or balmy, especially on the Tweed, because it's a tidal river and it can change very quickly. Now, down here at the base of this lane, they obviously didn't do it enough, because in 1881 there was an incredible storm where almost 200 fisherfolk lost their lives. Half the population of Eyemouth lost somebody, boats that were out to sea, the others from this river here in Berwick. And this is where the story of Archie Duncan comes in. This young man had 3 older brothers and a valiant father, all who fished on board the family Cobbled, and they had ventured away for weeks at a time to return with a bulging store of fish of every size and shape. Well, one Monday, little Archie told his mammy that he'd seen his daddy's boat tip over on the riverside, and it's just at the bottom of this hill. Right here, the bottom of the hill, next to the river. And he'd woke up crying. His mammy said, "Dinna you bleat. Your daddy's too good a sailor to let that happen." The fishing boat was being repaired, but they were due to leave for a long fishing trip into the North Sea this coming Friday, a day that this part of Northumberland still calls Black Friday. Every night that week leading up to Friday, Archie would wake up screaming, telling his mother that he'd had the same dream. Even his dad had tried to reassure him, but little Archie, who was 9 years old, begged him not to go to the sea that week. Now, you've got to remember, back then, the port here in Berwick wasn't as it is. They didn't have piers and what have you. A lot of the boats just sailed up the river, and they parked next to where the castle is, or in front of the castle, but certainly along that side. Young Archie, 9, begged his dad not to go to sea. He said, "Go next week and all's well, but not on Friday, Daddy, for we'll never see yous again." The young man's persistent gave his brothers a bit of a worry, but once more his father told him that, "Look, I'll be back on Sunday with plenty of fish to feed you, and I'll see you then." So, we are going to walk down just as Archie walked down. We're now at the edge of the main road into Berwick, the big well-lit bridge that comes across, and directly beside me, the Leaping Salmon, the big pub. You take a tiny right. You'd expect to walk down the bottom, but you come down here. Now, Archie and his mammy walked, the very narrow stairs, walked down here to where the boat was docked and waved them away, even though it wasn't, it's awkward down here. I think we better actually concentrate on looking where I'm walking, otherwise I will kill myself down here. We're heading down to the Tweed. A beautiful, and what an amazing river it is. It's only actually when you come and look for it properly and you see just Look at how wide that is. And in the distance you can see the 28 separate arches of the viaduct that's directly in front of us. The water is literally, every now and then you get a flat bit, but it's kind of flat but leaning down, if that makes sense. And we are now probably about 10 steps down to the main track. This is where you walk to go along to the castle. And Archie and his mum walked down to the dock, waved them away, even though, as I say, it was super early in the morning, because there was a good healthy tide. The weather seemed fine. His father reached into his pocket for a tribute for the sea and for the river, but he found he had no coin. Have you got a coin on you, Tony, just so that we can do this too? Have you got, by any chance, just any coin? Yeah, there you go, I'll take it. He's got a 20 pence or a twos. He's given us the two you tighten out. So, it's just, if we're telling the story, the least we can do is pay our tribute to. Hang on, here it goes. Just heard a little plop there in the distance. His father reached his pocket for a tribute for the sea. He didn't have any money on him. He asked his son for a tribute. They didn't have any, not a penny to their name. And this made little Archie lose it. He raced along the edge of the river and he found a shining pebble with a hole in it, thinking, this will be enough for a tribute. He raced back to throw it in, but by then it was too late. The Cobbled was already 200 yards up the river, bouncing on the tide that was pulling it out to sea, following other boats into the daily unknown for fishermen. Yet, less than an hour later, Berwick locals walking their dogs all raced back to their homes. A storm had erupted from nowhere, rain hammering into their faces from the sea. The swell began to crash down along the pier. People on the bankside of the river even had to move out of the way. The only person left on the pier, staring out to sea, was Archie, sobbing and crying. He knew for sure he'd never see his daddy and his brothers again. Each night his mother came down in the horrific weather, winds that had stripped roofs of their tails. The tip of the church steeple of St Andrew's collapsed into the church, and a boat that was tied to the dock had been crushed into matchwood. Finally, in monsoon-like rain, families began gathering along the dock. Not one of the fishing boats returned. One, badly damaged, crept back to Eyemouth, but none of Berwick's boats came home. With tales of a 50-foot swell that had sunk everything it had hit, sweeping boats up like they weren't there. After the storm, the odd piece of wood made it home. Others would see the odd flailing arm of a drowned man. It was a massacre. These hardy sailors had seen many a storm, but nothing close to this. Young Archie and his mum had no way of making a living. There's several versions of this legend, almost certainly based on truth, and one said that the family died of typhus the following winter, leaving poor Archie's spirit walking along that pier every night. Thousands had seen the wee grey spirit of a boy in short trousers, but many more have heard his bleating cries and sobs on the stairs down, outside the ice cream shop that we've left before. If you stand at the top listening down those dark, scary steps that used to be hacked out of clay and were mainly wet grass, and people would often fall, but thousands have heard the sobs. The story that's most spoken about seems to be that after a ceremony on the dock to remember those lost, his mother took Archie towards a wooden cottage in Spittal, which is about 1.5 miles away. They walked hand in hand along the sandy beach when she turned to the sea. "Archie," she said, "shall we go and see Daddy and your brothers? They're just out there." Archie said, "Oh, yes, please, Mother." There was an old fisherman sitting on a cliff top overlooking Spittal Beach, mending his fishing nets. And he told his pals in the tavern that night that earlier that day he had seen the strangest thing. The old codger told a bar full of at least 60 people that whilst working on his ripped net, he'd watched a woman with a wee boy start walking into the sea. He said he was just about to shout at them to call them back to shore when he saw a group of 4 men in the sea, walking to meet them. One of the men hugged the woman, then picked up the wee boy, and they all just disappeared out of sight under the sea. Within seconds, Spittal Beach is just exactly as it is now, empty, with the odd plaintive cry of the overfed seagulls. And yet every night that vivid image of Archie returns as a warning to all fisher folk to pay that tribute to the Tweed, to the rivers, and to the incredibly wild North Sea. But around here, if you listen quietly any evening, you'll hear him. And I've visited this area in the early hours on a few occasions, and it is a noise that I've heard, and it sends the hair on the back of your neck dancing. Some people say it could be cats, some people say it could be nesting seabirds. But one day, I'm sure I'll see him too, returning in a desperate attempt to keep all the other fishermen safe. Wee Archie is seen down this path. He's heard from the road above next to the Leaping Salmon, outside that ice cream store. And he's often seen along the main dock next to Spittal Beach. Gets about, but on every corner there's something. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to say nothing. I'm merely going to hold the microphone out, and I'm going to give Archie just a few seconds to maybe have his say. Archie, if you're there, let us hear you now. All I can say is he may be in Spittal instead of down here next to the river. And we're going down here now to the castle. So let's have a walk down in the darkness. Now, just had an interesting noise just off to the right-hand side. Now, when King Edward II was put to death on the 21st of September, now remember, you should be walking towards the castle, which is downhill along. There's some of those birds of ill omen, rooks and crows, symbol of spirit. When Edward was put to death, this is the second one, Longshank's son, 21st of September 1327. No one had the right to cheer louder than the people here in Berwick. Not a household stood that hadn't paid for his throne in blood. Edward I had died in 1307 on his way to invade Scotland, and his son felt duty-bound to continue that quest. Took him years to make any headway at all, as the tough and rugged border Scots weren't keen on a king who ruled from so far away. It was 1314 that English forces suffered their greatest and most humiliating defeat at Bannockburn. They were completely hammered by Robert the Bruce, who confirmed himself King of Scotland. Now Edward II decided that one of the few weapons left to him was fear, and this he used to the full. He would single out a village, then raze it to the ground, slaughtering anyone who stood in his way. Never before had a king adopted this sort of terror tactic against innocent civilians, and the people despised him for it. Edward would justify his actions, saying he was rooting out Scottish rebels, but it seemed to the people it was nothing but sheer bloodlust. The worst example was the tactic meted out against Beric on the chilly northeast coast here, straddling the border with Scotland. Edward's reputation was in tatters after abortive assaults against Scottish armies, now highly organised. He decided he must teach someone a lesson, and he decided that Berwick was going to be it. Now, what made this such a cowardly and loathsome thing to do was the fact that Berwick was just a market town, not particularly involved in any conflict. Certainly everyone you spoke to voiced an opinion, but certainly wasn't a nest of rebels. It certainly was a freezing morning when the English troops were spotted by men working on the land. They didn't think anything of it. English soldiers passed through regularly. They would buy food, make some money for local prostitutes and innkeepers, then they'd move on. It was the same when the Scots came down in their forays south. They were a bit different. The troops were not the same laughing and jolly Englishmen that had passed through Berwick some weeks before. They weren't in the mood to smile. As they approached the farm labourers, they drew their swords and cut them to the ground. As they marched into Berwick across the two bridges, it was barely dawn. Most people were still in their beds, and it was there they died. Innocent men, women and children, even babies in their cots, were put to the sword. Holy men, teachers, farmers and peasants alike, stabbed, hacked to death. A group of 50 or 60 locals decided to fight back, rallying on the outskirts of town, near the low bridge. They killed up to 30 English, until they themselves were overwhelmed by the sheer mass of soldiers that were there to face them. The tide was coming in, and the blood from such a mountain of bodies didn't just trickle into the Tweed. It flowed like a mountain stream. The Tweed was literally red with the blood of Berwick's innocent townsfolk. Other villages further upriver were warned of the massacre by the scarlet message sent on the tide, and when the English soldiers left this stronghold of the rebels, not a soul survived. The only Berwick citizens to live through that day were those that were out in fields a mile or so away, some farm workers that had scurried into the countryside, hiding themselves in the overgrowth. King Edward announced his great victory. He had conquered Berwick, a town full of insurrectionists, a nest of insects biting the hand that fed them. Truth was, it was bloody murder. Whoa! You hearing? Do you hear that? You kind of make this kind of stuff up. That's amazing. And it's just down here where the boat, and some boats actually docked alongside here too at the moment. Whoa, that was hair on the back of the neck time. Train going across the distant bridge as well. On top, along the 28 rainbow lit bridge. What a beautiful sight to see. And you see the reflection of it in the water at the same time. It's almost like science fiction, isn't it, Tony?
It looked great, that.
Beautiful looking thing, as the bridge just then turns from green to red. Since that day, people here in Berwick have witnessed a lot of strange phenomena. Screams after midnight when the town's silent, the chinking and clanking of swords and shields, the marching of men clattering along. In 1966, Mrs. L. Holmes from Sandyford, Newcastle, was visiting Berwick and was walking along the river exactly where I am now, just passing the bridge, when she saw the water change colour. It seemed to last for minutes, yet was probably only seconds, instead of the clear consistency where on most days you can see fish. It seemed to turn a glimmering red. She blinked, thinking it was a trick of the sun, but after focusing again, it was bright red. She happened to mention this to a local clergyman who told her the story, and she was quite petrified. In 1977, young Philip Gill from Edinburgh was out fishing for tiddlers with his little net. When he dipped his jam jar into the river, on pulling it out of the water was red. His father commented on the fact, saying, "No fish could survive in that." On scooping out more water, it all seemed tainted, and it was only after drawing water some 100 yards downstream that it seemed to clear up. Frances Marshall was driving into Berwick for a day trip in August 1981, and she claims what she describes as a sword fight. On approaching the town, she saw, once again close to the riverside, a group of up to a dozen men dressed in sackcloth and armour, fighting with swords and claymores. She presumed it was like a war society, restaging a battle, acting it out by interested townsfolk. But on visiting the Tourist Information Office, she was informed that no such event was currently happening. Frances now firmly believes that she has not witnessed ghosts, saying, "I think that maybe places can act rather like a video recorder, capturing things and occasionally playing them back. What I was seeing may well have been something from days gone by that actually happened." It's an interesting theory. Imagine if we could rewind life. Just think of all the things we'd change. Personally, I don't believe in fate, as it makes people stop trying, thinking whatever will be will be. and it takes advantage of those who choose to believe in it. But along this dark river, this beautiful, and I mean, it's a huge river. You come to Berwick and you get over that bridge and you're enveloped into the town. Come and spend time with the river. It's got stories to tell. Now, at the present moment, the tide's out, because normally the water would be right up to the side of the edges here. So you can see how difficult it was, even back in the day, for boats to come up here, because they'd have to stay in the water. And then when the tide would come in, they would pull them closer to the shore so they could get on and set sail and head off down the river and out to sea. But if they came this far up, they were very, very safe indeed, because you are so far away. The water here is like a mill pond at the moment. When the tide comes in first thing in the morning, it fills it right the way up. And during recent wet weather, when I was coming in from Scotland, crossing the Tweed, sometimes the water looks like it's almost up to the bridge. The odd plaintive cry of a seagull in the distance. It's a decent walk, mind, to this castle. So both Tony and I are putting a bit of a spirit on. And as I say, if you come here during the day, the river's right up to the edge, and you can't see the weed and the muck and the mud and the mire that just looks black on the left-hand side. Further out, you can see whatever lights are in the distance illuminating the river. This castle I've been to during the day, and I've seen stuff, kind of just almost things that are like plays tricks with the eyes. Things I can't explain. We got a couple of night owls who keep sending me photographs of this castle, and they, like me, you see shapes, you see shadows, you see just little things moving. You can see the castle in the distance now, Tony. Can you see it? No. Just past the bridge. See if you look straight ahead at the end arch of the viaduct, you see on the left-hand side. Just a little bit of castle sticking out.
I need to readjust.
Tony's got his little phone light on, leading the way.
Dies. God knows how we're going to get back.
In the pitch black, obviously. See, the arch is changing colour. Yeah. The middle bit seems to be off at the moment for some reason. It's bonny though, all this, yeah. And it's a good bit of exercise for you if you're trying to lose the occasional pound. Or the perfect bacon sandwich that I had earlier today. Promised you that I would. Did. It was very nice indeed. Only question was, one of the slices was a crust. That just knocks it off from being perfect. Cannot have a top bacon sandwich if one part's a crust. But was what it was. Oh, something nearly took my hat off. I think that's a overhanging tree. And there's another way up. You can get back out this way. There's extra stairs coming down. We might go back that way just for speed. Whew. But just looking up, the arches are lit red and blue at the moment. Red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. And yet the ones around the castle are ominously off. Actually, the lights stop on the opposite side of the river, so it's only the first 14 or so arches that are lit. We are now pretty much at the castle. It's literally just here to me. Whew. So, as I say, if you're going to walk in our Grizzly Trail, just make sure you're fairly able. And remember, if you can't do stairs, this possibly isn't one for you. You could come to Beric and just go around the castle walls, ticking off some of the places that you've heard on the trail. Wood, stone and steam. Standing below the soaring arches of the Royal Border Bridge, you realise how skilled the designers were, and it tells you how it's built. But we haven't come for that. We've come for blood. We've come for ghosts. We've come for spirit. And just past the bridge, walk right down where you see a dark black hole. That's the cat. You can almost tell audibly the sound is different. When you get to a dark place, sometimes the first thing you notice that's different is the sound. And this is interesting. There's an outcrop of the castle. This is absolutely incredible. It's dark, it's spooky. I'll just walk where there is no light. Down here. I'm now inside the castle. It's a ruin. It's open to the elements. You've got to be careful. It's a bit mushy under your feet. And then you come out a little bit at the other side. And you're back down beside the river again. You're right out in front where the river is. And then behind the castle, there are long fields that link up to houses and shops on the hillside. Once you get round the corner, you'll see the lights of where people live. This is where a lot of the main battles were fought against the English. It was right here. It was on their way to where the town was. And that's here. Scary part of Berwick upon Tweed. You got to remember, when they were fighting, there was no mega viaducts, no major bridges and trains and all the rest of it. So if you look with the viaduct behind you, down towards the river, a lot of the people, the English, would come across on boats rather than have to face loads of people blocking them on the bridges. They'd come across on boats, or they'd come from crossing places further up the river along the path here to face this great castle behind us. Not much of it left, bless it, but the bit that is here is extremely haunted. And I thought I caught a glimpse of something before just as I came in. It's kind of like a man figure. But
see this picture that I've got. It's
what?
A live picture.
It's a live picture.
So you'll see a bit of energy. Hold on. See that?
Oh my God.
Wow.
You've caught it.
I know, I've caught something.
That's brilliant.
It's
Tony.
It's like a...
It's a ghost.
Yeah.
You've just caught a ghost on camera.
Wow.
How would you make something like that up?
Well, I've just took that, so...
Well, I know that. I get it.
You can it?
That's
It's
fabulous.
It's like,
Fabulous.
It's a live photo, so it takes a
Go
few
back,
seconds.
take some more, because this is seriously haunted. Catch a few glimpses.
Got to be.
It's got to be. We just got a ghost clear as day. That's absolutely amazing. So do you take like live action pictures? How does it work?
Well, with the iPhone, it takes a few seconds before you take the picture, so it's a live photo.
You get a bit of movement before.
Yeah, so you get a few seconds before and after.
That
so it's
is
great.
that is absolutely bob on. Tony's now going along the river to take a few shots as well. This is where the battle was fought, up this hill here to the town. So might get something there. That is clear as day. We've caught a ghost full on. If you want to see it, we'll make sure that we get that onto our website. That's amazing. That is incredible. But there's metal gates stopping you getting into some of the tunnels and what have you. So I'm getting out the way so that Tony can take some of his pictures. But we've caught a ghost, and I must say it's more than I ever expected. I'm going up onto the castle walls, leaving Tony to do his thing. You can imagine if you were a Scot defending Beric, and at the present moment, when you get to the top of the castle walls here, it's an amazing view. I'm going right to the very, very top, and there's a seat you can sit on, covered with puddles, so I won't be sitting there. If you look along left, you can see Tweedmouth, which is the little town that's on the other bank of the Tweed, where you will find Robert Smith, one of the better fish and chip shops on earth. Wonderful. They got like little mini malls with Poundland and Marks and Spencers and what have you, and a lot of takeaways and eateries and farm foods, all those kind of places. A couple of antique shops too. And you can see that lit up. And that was not even a village back in the day. There was just this castle watching out for all comers. And then they'd spot the boats and they'd know they're coming. And they'd get their archers out ready to fire down onto the river. What an incredible place to be. And if you do come at night, just make sure you're with people that can keep you safe. This is a very peaceful and kind and gentle area, and leave it as you find it. No messing no rubbish and all that. Keep it as magnificent as it is. And when you're right up top, I'm where a turret would be, although the turret's long gone, but I'm on the castle wall. And if you look back, you can start to see, what it would really look like. Amazing. Absolutely incredible. It is an amazing place.
This is where I took that picture.
Up here.
Just looking down there.
Take some more. Please take some more. Let's see if we can catch some more pictures. What was just down here, was it?
It just seems like it was zooming out of there or something.
Coming out of a tunnel.
There's no tunnel there.
There's not even a door.
Nah.
Weird. So here we are at Berwick Castle, the ruins of it anyway. It was built in the early 1100s, that's by King David I. And once England's king, Edward, the Hammer of the Scots, took the town in 1296, he rebuilt this and he put castle-style defences right the way around the town, costing as much money, we're told, as Trident, we were told before. And because this castle was on the border, it had been in Scotland, then England, then Scotland, then England, but in 1286, a Scotsman called William MacLeod was injured in a battle on the outskirts of Berwick. Both his legs were broken, falling from a horse, and they'd healed badly, so he would drag his legs separately. MacLeod was a proud Scot, having spent years fighting against English invaders. What could he do now that he couldn't ride? He couldn't easily fight. He offered to be a custodian of this castle, Berwick Castle, fighting off any army sought on taking it. He loved the bagpipes, so every evening as the sun began to set, he would play on the main tower where I've just been standing, to let everybody in Berwick know that all was well. The castle, of major tactical use, and Edward I of England wanted it to become his headquarters while he attacked the Scots and chased William Wallace. He decided to retake the castle at all costs. For 15 weeks the English bombarded the castle and finally took it, capturing the 87 Scots on doing so. They were taken down to the river's edge just below where Tony got that photograph of the ghost, and they were dispatched. Their heads were removed, their lifeless bodies floating back out to sea on the spring tide. The heads placed along the battlements as a warning to Berwick folk, mostly loyal to the Scots, not to interfere. The day of the final successful assault, MacLeod was in Jedburgh. He wasn't even in the castle because his parents were dying of typhus. But on getting back to the castle, he found it under the control of the English. The Red River, running scarlet, the grass along the bankside crimson with blood, the blood of his friends. He wanted to explode with rage, but his battered body wouldn't allow it. Instead, he walked up to the castle and asked, "Do you want a piper?" At first they said no, but as he walked away, one of the king's equerries chased after him, thinking that if the locals heard pipes, maybe they'd be more accepting of the English presence. King Edward I even agreed it was a good idea, so that very night, from this particular battlement, MacLeod played a medley of tunes. Now the locals all laughed, knowing that a lot of the tunes that he was playing had words that insulted the English, but the English had no clue. Every night for almost 9 weeks MacLeod played for a pittance and his meals, until a councilman from Alnwick arrived and asked why they had a piper playing songs of the rebellion over a Scottish castle. MacLeod was arrested, beaten and brought to the king. He claimed that they were just tunes he'd heard. He didn't know any words. They didn't believe him, and he was hanged from a beam over the main castle gate that we've just walked into. But it seems MacLeod decided never to leave. And if you take photographs of the ruins, there's always a feeling that you're being watched. Others get strange light anomalies, odd shadows. Many in Berwick have even heard the sound of bagpipes in the distance, always coming from the direction of the castle. His ghost in Berwick is Berwick's most commonly witnessed. Some years later, Richard the Lionheart would sell the castle back to the Scots to raise money for his vindictive and bloody crusades. Then in 1482, the Duke of Gloucester came back and retook the castle, and it's been English ever since. But I think we've just seen MacLeod. we've caught him on camera, and we'll let you have a look at that picture a little bit later on. Now, to cover us getting from here to where we're going next, what's the name of this pub, Tony?
I think it's the Free Trade Inn.
The Free Trade Inn. Now, when we were checking for ghosts, we took a look and we discovered the Free Trade, and also Meadow House, which is a restaurant I've been to. Nice restaurant, standard kind of country fare. They do the whole Sunday lunch kind of thing. The Meadow House has the distinction of being the last pub in England and the first coming from Scotland. Well, since the early days of the A1, locals have known that it follows the old Roman military road. It was the coaching route used by mail coaches between London, York and Edinburgh. And one ghost that haunts this inn was one of these carriage drivers, killed in a crash near the Meadows House, with his body taken inside. Other apparitions there is a killed soldier. But there's just kind of limited tales to tell, and the people there are currently on holiday. So to cover us getting back into town and up to the Free Trade, if you keep travelling north from Berwick, as if you're heading to Edinburgh, you come across a particular area of land that has hidden caves you can only see from the beach. And when the tide comes in, the entire doorway to the cave is hidden. And it's in that cave where you find the cannibalistic lair of Britain's biggest ever serial killer, Sawney Bean. We're going to have a listen to what happened when I was up there. We're going to tell you the story of Sawney Bean and a little bit of the action that I got up to when I was there. And hopefully, by the time that comes out, I'll be up to or very near the Free Trade pub. We'll tell you what happens there. From a woman who's been there 46 years. She knows Beric like the back of her hand. It's the Grizzly Trail. In the dark days, before cars, nobody could travel more than 30 or 40 miles in a single day, and travelling from London to Scotland on horseback was far from enjoyable. And no matter how good a rider you were, you ended up with bruises on your backside and a stiff neck. So people tried really hard to break up their journeys by staying at as many inns dotted across the way. And the most favoured route through the northeast took them through Yorkshire, across Teesside, and across a tiny little bridge in Newcastle, long since replaced by the Swing Bridge. And it was this route that the newlyweds Elizabeth and Rodney Thorpe had taken on their journey to the new matrimonial home in Edinburgh. They were married in York at Elizabeth's request, as all of her family, the Campbells, lived thereabouts. Ever the gentleman, Rodney had suggested that they travel by coach, but his wife, a keen horsewoman, decided it would be far more exciting and a damn sight more romantic if they ride to their new home. And exciting it was, but any hopes of romance were soon ground into dust. They spent their first night in Durham in a coach house, failing to get much sleep due to the revelling of drunks in the inn below. The honeymoon began in Newcastle, where the couple spent 3 days and 3 nights at lodgings near the quayside. And it was in Newcastle that they were told by a blacksmith of the perils of travelling through Northumberland. Over a period of about 7 to 8 months, over 100 people had disappeared. The government of the day had presumed it was the work of innkeepers robbing and murdering, as it had on the west coast. Well, the Thorpes' journey along the magnificent Northumbrian coast continued, and it seemed as if they were following in the footsteps of a troop of soldiers. And on reaching Tynemouth, they saw a gallows, and there, swinging in the biting wind, was a portly fellow bobbing like a dead bird in a water tank. A decree had been made that 30 innkeepers would be hanged for the murders of their guests. Innocent or guilty, nobody knows. There was no trial. They were executed. So they proceeded along the coastal road. Every 5 or 6 miles, they came across another gallows. Bodies eaten away by the salt air, eyes pecked out by crows, weevils and flies swarming over the rotting corpses. They were welcomed at every inn by those hollow sockets staring at them, teeth clenched in agony, another twisted body with a snapped spine. They were only 3 days away from Edinburgh when they set off for the last... Hang on a second. Getting a kind of a hollowish sound. They both had decided that the road ahead took them to Berwick and across the border. And on a warm sunny day they could have had no inkling of the horror ahead. They both stopped to gaze at the waves beating into the craggy cliffside as tiny rainbows seemed to appear in the water, cascading back into the sea. They were just hypnotised by the beauty of it all, and they smiled at one another, leaned into a lingering kiss, and then headed back to the road. And yet suddenly they were surrounded by dozens of filthy ruffians in rags, all shouting and waving clubs, axes and crudely made spears. Elizabeth was dragged from her horse and brutally hurled to the ground. In less than a second, her dress was torn from her. Rodney believed she was about to be raped, so rode at her attackers, striking them with his riding crop. And as he hit out at them, he saw a glint of steel being raised above her. A long curved blade struck down. Blood spurted into the air as a gurgling scream sent shivers down his spine. He gazed down in horror to see her stomach wide open as they ripped out her insides and proceeded to eat her alive. A white bearded man, Sawney Bean, seemed to be in command of this ragtag gang. So anyway, they were eating this poor girl alive. The old man, Sawney, stared up and thought, blood trickling through his bearded, bleached whiskers, and he shouted, "Get him!" And as the life mercifully drained from Elizabeth, the brigands stood up, some of them clenching bloody intestines and forcing them into their mouth, others just crazed with excitement. They charged towards him, and his horse took it upon itself to veer away from the throng. It galloped north with Thor swaying in the saddle. He was dizzy with fear. His brain failed to comprehend what he'd seen. He begged that God would let him wake up and end this nightmare, but sadly fate had taken him too far. The horse's mouth frothed as it began to tire, and the last few miles of its journey he had to do on foot. Now, on arriving at Edinburgh Castle, a detachment of soldiers were immediately dispatched to accompany him back to the place just north of Berwick. They'd been told to find Elizabeth's body and apprehend the murderers. Well, it took them 2 days for them to get there. 30 troops at a forced march, 2 officers on horseback, and Thorpe. It was late in a May evening when they arrived, and there was nobody about. The only evidence of the crime was a huge patch of clotting gore being feasted on by maggots and beetles. As fat, blood-gorged flies buzzed into the faces of anybody who got too close. They searched for tracks and found those of a group of around 50 men dragging something down to the beach. And then the footprints disappeared into the sea. Had they escaped by boat? Pirates were commonplace along the northeast coast, but they drank rum, not blood. The officer, having checked the area, decided that there was nothing more that could be done, so the following morning they would begin their trek back to Edinburgh. They camped in a copse of trees just off the seaside. They managed to kill a deer and settle down for the night. Rodney Thorpe was sickened by his experience. Why couldn't they have taken him? Elizabeth was so beautiful, only 23 years of age. It was all such a waste. Just as the snores of the hardened fighting men were at their height. Thorpe awoke with a scream. He was swearing and gibbering like an idiot. It would be many a month before he could face the pictures in his dreams, pictures painted by his troubled mind. They calmed him down, gave him a tot of whiskey from a small silver hip flask, then tried to snatch whatever rest they could. Morning crept up on them unnoticed, and as they collected their muskets and packs, one young soldier noticed that the tide had gone way out. And once this had been brought to the attention of the officer, he ordered that a search be made of the area, and within minutes they located a lace shawl. That was the shawl that her mother had given her, the shawl she'd been wrapped in as a baby, and as her mother and grandmother had been before. And at the end of the beach, the cliffs began to rise and looked as if they were going to crash down onto the sand. One soldier had begun searching the dark, clangy nooks and crannies when suddenly he took off his tricorn hat and began to wave furiously. Everybody raced across the wet sand, and they were ordered to be quiet, so as not to give any advanced warning of their presence. What the young soldier had discovered was this cave. The cave that winds from sea level into the cliff. And when the tide's in, as you know, the entrance completely underwater, but inside the cave dry and safe. And as they made their way in, and as I closed my eyes, I can't help but imagine what it must have been like for them to step into this place for the very first time, knowing that there might be 70 to 100 people in here. The first thing they said was the faint aroma of crackling pork. Way off in the distance, the shimmer of a burning torch. They crept silently towards the light, the soldiers eventually peering into that huge hollow cavern where lived the incestuous family of Sawney Bean. Ragged remnants of humanity huddled around that huge campfire, men, women and children, many of them twisted and bent. And it takes a while for your eyes really to get adapted to this kind of darkness, and they felt their stomachs tighten when they discovered that what they thought was roast pork was in fact a young child turning on a spit. Vomit fought its way into the throats of the soldiers. One man turned to run, only to bump into something hanging from the cavern wall. As they looked up, they spotted bodies, dozens of them, sliced into pieces, salted and dangling against the cool rock passage, hanging from those manacles that we found before. The eyes of the soldiers were wild with fear and revulsion. The officer knew that he would have to act now, or he would lose control of his men, because they were all on the verge of panic. He ordered his men to cock their muskets and fix bayonets, and then they began walking into the main cave area. Many of the men grabbed clubs, yet after 3 shots exploded into the cave, killing 2 and wounding a 3rd. All fighting stopped. Thorpe told the officer that their leader was a small, pock-faced man with a white beard and mad-staring eyes. He had yet to be found. As the soldiers began to bind the crowd of cannibals, Thorpe made his way back down the tunnel, mercifully not noticing that one of the joints of human flesh that he strode past was that of his beloved Elizabeth. He was 20 yards from the cavern entrance when out of nowhere a man stood eye to eye with him, mad eyes, a white beard tinged with blood. It was Sawney Bean. Thorpe grabbed him. They wrestled to the floor. Bean had managed to draw that long curved knife and was about to use it when a soldier loomed out of the darkness to knock the knife spinning from his hand. Seeing he was outnumbered, Bean began to run back towards the beach. Thorpe and the soldiers, slipping on the seaweed and the green slime-covered stones, they pursued him along the beach, and he was heading towards the horses, tied up by the campfire. On reaching Thorpe's horse, he clenched its mane and was about to pull himself on board when a rifle butt appeared over the horse's back and sank into the old man's face. He fell like a sack of potatoes, blood soaking onto the grass, as had that of so many of his victims. Over 40 people were taken back to the garrison camp, and they were all charged with murder, and they were all found guilty. One baby boy was born whilst his mother was in prison, and that child was given to a family called Ross, who raised the baby as their own. The men were hanged and the women taken to the outskirts of Edinburgh, where they were burned at the stake. It was said that on Hallows Eve, if you look out from the battlements of Edinburgh Castle towards the hill known as Arthur's Seat, you can still see the glint of flame as these devilish women sink down into the pit of hell. If a strong wind whistles along the castle's rocky escarpment, it echoes the cries of torment as the fire consumed them. Sawney Bean's name became a legend because he ate people right here And hanging was not enough for him. He was taken from his rat-infested cell, stretched on a rack until many of his bones were broken. He was throttled with a knotted rope, and then, once revived, he was gutted. His stomach was opened and his innards removed one at a time. It's claimed that he was still alive as they tied his arms and legs to 4 horses. And after a count of 5, a musket was fired and the horses all ran off in different directions, wrenching Sawney Bean into quarters. Although this was a long time ago in the border country, they still talk of the baby given to the family called Ross. This baby born to cannibals, raised not on the breast but on the blood of the innocent. And it was said that when the child got to be 3 months old, it bit so deeply into his mother's breast that the nipple was chewed and swallowed. The Free Trade Inn is historic here in Berwick. It's been here a long time.
1767.
1767. Now you didn't start with it.
I think so. It was 250 years old last year.
Wow. What's your name, darling?
It's Brenda Collins.
To talk about spooky stories, if ever you were going to get anything, surely this place must have something.
It's mostly been like children's voices. But recently, he's been hearing my voice. Jim, he doesn't live with me, but he does a lot of my shopping. He's my nephew. He's always hearing me shouting on him when I'm in another part of the house, wherever. And years ago, it used to be my daughter's voice when she was just a teenager.
Really?
My daughter's voice shouting, "Ma'am."
There's a lot of people who have said that they've said something to someone and then that person's heard them ask them a question. When they look around, that person's not there. So it's almost like copying the voice.
It was always just "Ma'am," you know. And I mean, go to the toilet, you'd just gone into the toilet and you'd hear "Ma'am," and you remember that she was at your mother's, or there was somebody broke into the place across the road, lads broke a window, and I could hear her shouting "Man," and I shouted back to her, "I'll be there in a minute." And I remembered she was staying with a friend in Edinburgh.
When you first took it over, what was the first thing that happened that made you realise?
The first thing I ever actually saw, I used to have my young nephew came up, and he was so young, I used to carry him around the pool table on a little stool, and he used to play pool. And we opened the pub at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. The first customer in stood there talking to my husband, then he started practising darts.
Right.
I was in the pool room, moving him around the pool table. At the top of the ice bucket came out and hit the mirror, just came flying through and hit the mirror along there. And it's most of the things have happened in that little area behind where you can see the cut-off.
Do we know what this was? Has it always been a tavern even before you took it on?
Oh yes, it's always been a pub.
Yeah, amazing.
It was built first in 1767 for Mr. Curry for £60.
And great value if you realise how long it's lasted.
1767.
But when you think of 1767, you will have had in this pub press gangers, pirates, sailors, all of that stuff.
Well, it was still in the middle. It wasn't long after the battle of whatever, it's big going up the road there.
You didn't care as long as they came in for a pint after.
No. It was only 10 pence a pint when we came in.
What? It's unbelievable that you know everything about Berwick. We've been doing this trail around telling the history and some of the amazing stories that people have. Everybody's got a story here because so much has happened here. Has it?
Border town, I think.
Absolutely, and it's to and fro a little bit. It's danced a bit with the English and the Scots vice versa.
You can see I'm pro-Scottish because I've got two.
I saw the flag and I'm absolutely If you were to tell anybody to come to Berwick, what was the one thing that you would suggest they did before anything, apart from obviously having a pint at the Free Trade?
Just go around the walls because you're taking a walk in history.
Absolutely.
You start at one side of the walls and you come back and you've done the full tour where they used to lock the doors to stop the Scots getting in at one time. The ghost spoke to Jim.
The ghost spoke to Jim. Jim, can I borrow you just a second? Yeah. Come over here, nephew. The ghost spoke to you. To tell us about it. What happened?
Just shouted on us. Just
in her voice?
In her voice, aye.
Is this not just because you're so used to her shouting at you? Is that?
No. No. I was down the stairs and she was up the stairs and somebody shouted on us.
So you don't know who the boss really is in this building?
That's a ghost, I think.
That's a ghost of the boss, aye.
My son-in-law actually saw an old man, but I mean, a head of an old man. He's the only one in all the years that I ever saw anybody. Wow. And that was and it wasn't drink because he was driving.
Fantastic. Hey, but guys, Jim, thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Bless you, Brenda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Hope you have a good
We will. Thank you. And that is, of course, the free trades. You just have a look at it. 1746. And it's exactly the same. And that's it, really. We're done. What a night, though. Could you believe you'd have as much stuff as we got
I know,
today?
amazing. Probably as much as York, and that's bigger.
I know, absolutely.
Amazing.
And the thing about this place is, York, completely crowded, thousands of people in all directions, always. You come here, you got a bit of space, you got beautiful fresh air. We never touched the coast, we never touched the beach, we never touched Tweedmouth. It's on the opposite side of the river, which is Berwick's Gateshead to Newcastle, if you know what I mean. And there's beaches there, and shops and stores. Some of the best fish and seafood you'll get anywhere in the world here. You got to come, whether you grizzle it or whether you just want to do the tourist thing. Don't miss it. And hey, you can get a train up from Newcastle in about 35-40 minutes. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? Amazing stories, incredible place. That was tonight's Grizzly Trail. Hope you enjoyed it. From me, Alan Robson, good night, God bless you, and I wish you well.